I found it really interesting to go back and think about what we might have gotten wrong about Wilson's time in Seattle and who we attributed blame to.
You were in that locker room. Is it fair to say Seattle offensively was a little behind the times?
I never thought they had a personnel issue. The conversations that I would have with the coaches and the amount of pushback and the amount of questions that I would get in return saying, we're not sure if we can do this. I'm not sure if we can protect this. And I'd sit there scratching my head.
Russell Wilson's new team looked exactly like his old team. It was the most striking thing to me about watching the Broncos play the Jaguars. It was a game in London, so it's early out here. It becomes the advance. I think it was on ESPN+. And Denver's first 4 possessions, none of them gained a first down. First one ends with an interception. First one ends with a third down sack. Second one ends with an interception. 2 more where they don't gain a first down. And then all of a sudden he kind of catches fire. 5 straight completions on a drive. It ends with a touchdown pass to Jerry Jeudy, but it's really more like a fly sweep where Russ just tosses the ball forward and Jeudy runs it into the end zone. In the second half, you saw a little bit more of that, where there were 2 touchdown drives where Wilson looked awesome, and then there were a bunch of possessions where the Broncos didn't do anything. It was like all of those things we used to chalk up to Seattle's offense and say it's the game plan, it's the emphasis on establishing the run, and the only way Seattle was able to score was when Russ kind of takes matters into his own hands and digs things out. And that's what he did with that touchdown drive at the end of the first half. It's what he did in the second half. I mean, he led a game-winning drive. It's a fourth quarter comeback. He has the second most of any quarterback since he entered the league. It was really not a carbon copy because Seattle's offense has generally looked better with Wilson than Denver's offense has looked. But it's enough similar that I found it really interesting to go back and think about what we might have gotten wrong about Wilson's time in Seattle and who we attributed blame to. And some people have objected to this and said it's revisionist history. And yeah, it is. It's going back and saying, did we get it right? And one of the more interesting things was an interview that Greg Olsen did with Colin Cowherd after the trade. Now, Olsen played a year, most of a year, part of a year, with the Seahawks. It's 2020, and he suffered a foot injury that knocked him out for the middle chunk of the season, but he came back and played. It was a disappointing season for I don't think either he or the team was happy with the way it went. I don't think it was a bad signing. I think Olsen is an incredibly perceptive. I think he's a good analyst. I like listening to him do games on Fox. And his interview with Colin Cowherd, it's interesting because Olsen gives voice to what a lot of people thought, which is that the issue is the structure, and Russ wanted to be able to do more. So this is from March 2022, so earlier this year after the trade.
You were in that locker room. Is it fair to say Seattle offensively was a little behind the times?
I never thought they had a personnel issue. The conversations that I would have with the coaches and the amount of pushback and the amount of questions that I would get in return saying, we're not sure if we can do this. I'm not sure if we can protect this. And I'd sit there scratching my head. It was like we were playing with a JV roster. It was like we were playing with a rookie undrafted quarterback. Like it was.
A lot of people listened to that and thought it was a criticism of Seattle's personnel. It clearly was not. In fact, the full cut of Olsen's answer, he goes through and he mentions Chris Carson by name. He talks about Dwayne Brown. And he says at the beginning, I never thought it was a personnel issue. What he's saying is I scratch my head wondering, why is this structure? Why aren't we doing more? And the answers that he got were that we can't protect it. We're not sure if we can. It was basically like, hey, we're not going to try doing that. He chalked it up to underestimating the personnel. And I think a lot of people did. I don't know if I went fully as to say, hey, I think that Seattle should confer more upon Russell Wilson, but I definitely felt like, okay, your quarterback's going to leave if you don't do that. And maybe Pete just isn't comfortable with having his team ride or die with the quarterback's performance. And that's just the way he's going to approach the game. And it doesn't really matter if it's Russell Wilson or it's someone else, that he's got a way that he thinks his quarterback should play. There's a pretty strong track record of success about that. Now, primarily that's in college, but Carson Palmer, Mark Sanchez, Matt Leinart. I mean, Palmer and Leinart won Heisman trophies. And Leinart clearly didn't have the success in the pros that people anticipated. I don't want to say that Palmer was better in college than in the pros because he had a weird career. He was stuck in Cincinnati. He also had some injuries, blew out his knee, and then later had a shoulder problem. So I don't want to say, because I think Carson Palmer had a really good NFL career. And I wouldn't characterize him as like, hey, he never fulfilled the promise of a number 1 overall pick. Like, I think he's a really good player. Did he have his best years at USC? Like that year he had with, yeah, probably. Like that was either that or the season right before the knee injury. He suffered the knee injury in the playoffs. Like Pete's had success with that. What's happening in Denver has caused me to kind of question whether, or to think, I think people exaggerated the flaws in Pete Carroll's coaching and attributed it to his stubborn insistence when he might have been following the program that he thought was best for not just any quarterback, but for this quarterback. All of the things that we chalked up to Carroll's outdated offense have moved to Denver. It might be an overstatement, but I think the sustained stretches where nothing's happening offensively and you're like, this doesn't look like an NFL offense, we're seeing that in Denver. The play clock, the fact that it was constantly up against the play clock. I always chalk that up to Seattle's disorganized sideline. Pete's energetic. He's got a lot of people on the sideline. He likes that energy and that juice. I thought that they were constantly pushing up against the play clock, occasionally having to burn timeouts when you wouldn't want to. Because of that, the plays weren't coming in time. It was disorganization. In Denver, what happened those first couple weeks? Delay of game penalties. It got the crowd was counting down the play clock to help the offense avoid delay of game penalties. That migrated. So that sort of sense that, oh, this was Pete's fault. It might have been the way the quarterback was playing. It might have been the way the quarterback plays the game. And that's made me look back at something like, look, Olsen knows an awful lot about it. Not only that, he was there. And he came away thinking that this was about the approach. Let's continue with his interview here because he gets into what he thought motivated Wilson to ultimately ask out.
Very interesting to me. I just think the ideology there was always defense first, kicking game, punt the ball, field position, force turnovers, defensive led, and then they'd hand the ball to Russ at the end of the game and say, go be magic. I just think it was part of Russell's frustration. I think it's why Russ said, I want to go somewhere where this is going to be an offensive, quarterback-driven team every Sunday with the ball in my hand, like Aaron Rodgers, like the Stars.
That's what we all thought, right? And I would say that was very understandable. Like, I got why Russell wanted that. He's like, dude, I want to see how far I can take it. We've gotten to a point in Seattle where we've kind of plateaued. Like, if you look at his full 10 seasons in Seattle, I would say that the first 5 of those, you had a dominant defense, more dominant at the beginning of those 5 years than the end, but a dominant defense, and Russ is sort of the playmaker, the closer. Like, if he didn't have to do the heavy lifting, they weren't going to ask him to do the heavy lifting. They didn't go into a game thinking, hey, he'll need to throw 30, 35 times to win it. Okay, so we get to the end of 2016. That's the year that they win their first round. They win the division. They win their first round playoff game against Detroit. They then go to Atlanta and they lose. And that's kind of in my mind, the end. That's the season Richard Sherman blows up on the sideline in the Thursday night game against the Rams. Marshawn Lynch is no longer there that year. You've kind of got a changing of the guard after that. And the next season, Seattle misses the playoffs. Sherman gets hurt, blows out his Achilles. Cam Chancellor gets hurt. Cliff Averill gets hurt. There's a changing of the guard that starts after that year. And from that point on, it's no longer a dominant defensive-led team. It's still a good defense. But the best part about that team at that point, it's clearly Russell Wilson's team. And they miss the playoffs that year. They go 9-7. And then we see for the next 4 years, on the one hand, you could say they're improving, right? They go from 9 wins in 2017 to 10 wins and making the playoffs in 2018. They lose that first-round game against Dallas. 2019, they end up going to the playoffs. They win their first-round playoff game. They're there as a wild card. They beat Philadelphia in that game where Carson Wentz is knocked out. They don't look that great. Then they go on the road to Green Bay. They're in that game, but you felt that there was a gap between, okay, they're a playoff contender. They're not a Super Bowl. They're not like they were in 2014 or even 2015 when you're like, that's one of the teams that is one of the 5 favorites to get to the Super Bowl. The next year, they get back to the playoffs. They win 12 games, but the second half of the season, they're not as good. They have a bad playoff loss. They lose at home to the Rams. Jared Goff isn't playing. Aaron Donald gets hurt, and their offense looks bad. It was a bad game. It's in my mind the worst playoff loss they've suffered. It's at home. It makes you feel like the whole 12 wins was built on smoke and mirrors, and that's kind of, they were getting better, but it felt like they were that good enough to get into the playoffs, and maybe they catch fire and win a Super Bowl, but it didn't feel, they're not one of the Super Bowl favorites. And it felt like that's where they were stuck in Russell's second 5 years. 2021, he gets hurt. Seattle could have talked itself into the idea that we're fine. We won 4 of our final 6 games. If he doesn't get hurt, we're probably fine. We're just going to go back. We know he's pissed. We know he's unhappy, but we're not going to give up our franchise quarterback. I can understand at that point where Russ is like, you know what? I want to see how far I can take this on my own. I've got a coach that is not going to put all of that on me. He doesn't want the offense to flow through me in the way that Green Bay does with Rodgers, the Chiefs do with Mahomes, the Bills with Josh Allen, and I want that. I've got 10 years of history, 9 straight winning seasons. I'm one of the winningest quarterbacks to start a career in NFL history. I want to see what happens. Like, totally understandable. And that's what's so intriguing to me about this season is there is kind of a test of systems. And while 8 games isn't enough to make any firm declarations, especially because Wilson is hurt, like whether it's the hamstring that kept him out, the shoulder problem, like the things that he's going through, and I think like the issues that you can see, that the flaws that we're all seeing and people are pointing to, they've been there before. Russell's been able to overcome them with other things. He's always missed open dudes. Like that's happening. In fact, there has been a long conflict between what I consider sort of the tape grinders and the people that fixate on evaluating NFL footage through the lens of how a scout would see it and trying to sort of emulate that process. Those guys who have not liked Wilson. Andy Benoit is part of that group. There was another dude, he's Irish. I think Sean Fahey is his name. He was with ESPN. I'm not sure if he's still doing it. But there were people that looked at Russ and they're like, he doesn't play the game. He doesn't make the progressions like your quarterback is supposed to. And they didn't like him. I mean, Andy Benoit I'd rather have Matthew Stafford than Russell Wilson, which to me it's a silly opinion because Russell Wilson's career has been so much more consistent than Stafford's. Probably looks a little bit different now with Stafford coming off, but still, you ask me to evaluate those two guys' careers. I think Russell's been the better player, but it looks different how he plays. It does. It looks different, and you have sustained periods of inactivity or when the offense looks incompetent, and then all of a sudden it'll catch fire. We used to chalk those up or say that's Russ taking over from an inferior system. I don't think that you can say that declaratively anymore. Or this idea that Seattle didn't accentuate Russell's strengths. It's possible that Seattle's offense was structured the way it was to maximize Wilson's strengths. And the flaws that we always attributed to the overly conservative nature were actually kind of reflections of how Russ plays the game. And this isn't to go back and say, like, oh, listen to how stupid Greg Olsen is. Greg Olsen's not stupid. Greg Olsen knows way more about that offense than I do, in part because he worked there for a year. But there's something very complicated about Russell Wilson and the way he fits into an NFL offense. And I think that what has happened these first 8 games in Denver speaks to that. Doesn't mean that Seattle handled it perfectly or that Seattle wouldn't have been better served in 2018 or 2019, giving Russ more responsibility or having the offense go more through him. But this idea that it was negligent on Seattle's part to do it, or that it was incapable, because right now you're seeing Russ in the kind of offense he's always sought to run. And, okay, Nathaniel Hackett, a lot of people think is incompetent, unable to do the job, all of those different things. Well, I know that Hackett was one of the guys that Russ was really interested in as offensive coordinator when they hired Shane Waldron. And Aaron Rodgers thinks incredibly highly of Nathaniel Hackett. And that offense that he's put in place is drawn from a lot of really successful offenses. So it's possible he's just a dum-dum and is a good coordinator and a terrible head coach or all of those other things. It's also possible that he provided the kind of structure that Russell Wilson has been seeking, and Wilson's not the right guy to run that kind of offense. And that is maximizing instead of minimizing his flaws. That we're seeing those shortcomings in more glaring fashion now, because anybody who goes and says Russell held back Seattle's offense for the past 5 years, that's stupid. That's absolutely dumb. The Seahawks set a franchise record for points in 2020. And this is a franchise that had Mike Holmgren and Matt Hasselbeck that won 13 games in 2005. And that was an awesome offense. So the idea that Seattle was somehow stuck with Russell Wilson is silly. Dude is a great quarterback. He's not playing great right now, and his team is not thriving. And it's really interesting to re-explore what that means for that sort of division of blame that was chalked up for why Seattle wasn't more successful in that 2017 to 2020, 2021 period. Russell Wilson's second 5 years. I'm Danny O'Neill. This is the Dang Apostrophe. It's an accompaniment to a newsletter that I've been doing. I would encourage you all to subscribe. I'm honestly not sure how frequently or how often I'm going to do like longer form videos here. It's something I'm experimenting with. Feel free to leave a comment. And as I said, you can find my written work on Substack, the Dang Apostrophe.